men and women both, as far as what they feel. The interesting thing about it is that over the course of 40 years or so of talking to people, I've noticed slowly a shift where the what seems to be kind of innate, if you will, in terms of the two genders and which way they head toward handling the kind of internal kind of emotional pain that grief brings with it, ends up being changed over time. Sometimes they get more alike rather than being different, and seeing that as okay. So, so with that being said, let me pray real quick, and then we'll get going. Father, guide our hearts and our conversation today as we talk about grief some more in the context of just who we are and how we're designed, and how we relate to one another. Help us to have discernment and a willingness to consider maybe some different perspectives, just about, and even the element of accepting ourselves where we are. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so you may or may not have ever seen this. Hello, 1950s, you left your oppressive gender roles in our century. Can you come pick it up? This applies. This certainly applies in this area of grief, and it cuts both ways. It's a blade that cuts both ways for people. So what in terms of that, let me show you a brief video that was a compilation video put together of all the stereotypes. And as you're watching this, I would encourage you to just jot a couple notes down in terms of what's portrayed here, because the video isn't about grief, okay? It's just about stereotypes that we carry around with us. A lot of times it's really hard to surface these. And so you have a variety of them. Some of them reach back pretty far. I mean, 50s doesn't sound real far to me, but it does to you. So some of the commercials that they put together from this is from the late 50s, early 60s. And you can just watch. You can watch really how this goes. The first one is looking at a very, very, very young Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he has to entertain an assertion by a little person. So here we go.
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
Thanks for the tip.
Thank you so much. With my new Electrolux appliances. Now I can cook the roast for the dinner party and the mac and cheese for the sleepover. Simmer the chocolate sauce, toss Chucky's toy, stir the gummy bears, then the apple juice at the perfect temperature, be the charming co-host, clean the stemware perfectly, and end the night looking for monsters under the bed. Introducing Electrolux with weight touch controls and an induction hybrid cooktop that boils water in 90 seconds. You can be even more amazing.
I met up with Washington Examiner columnist and TV pundit LaShawn Barber, my conservative love friend.
Women are the weaker sex. A leader should radiate confidence, manly confidence. Women have a very nurturing quality, but I don't really want a nurturing leader.
By nurture, I assume you mean to take care of people.
Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't want that either.
I want someone commanding, forthright. Men just seem to embody these qualities more, at least for me.
Yes. When's the last time a president cut a meeting short to go feed a baby with his balls?
Hey, what's a little pizza? I get a thank crust.
Hello?
Yeah, we like a large thin crust pizza. Round the chop shop.
There are three manly men.
Perry gets his chest waxed.
He loves tenant pillows. Jerk make sterile.
We have a winner.
I can't get pregnant and I already got a fertility test. So why don't you just ask him to get tested?
Turk is very sensitive when it comes to his manliness. Remember when I told him his backpack looked like a purse?
Turk, honey, I didn't mean it. I love it.
Now there's a place where her dreams have room to grow. Rose Meadow Cottage.
And my muffin, it's really yummy.
A place of her very own, where she you can decorate.
This can go here. This goes here.
Entertain your imagination.
Let's do laundry.
And a special friend.
You wonder why your parents are so screwed up.
I love what she's done with the place, the Rose Petal Cottage. It's her place where her dreams have room to grow.
I want a trainer. I don't want charity, and I don't want favors. You're not interested, then I got more celebrating to do.
Stop. Stop. The hell are you doing? Okay. If I'm gonna take you on,
You won't never regret it.
look, just listen to me. If I take you on,
I promise I'll work so hard.
God, this is a mistake already.
Mm-mm. I'm listening, boss.
If I take you on, you don't say anything, you don't question me. Don't ask why, you don't say anything except maybe, yes, Frankie. And I'm gonna try to forget the fact that you're a girl.
That's all I ask.
And don't come crying to me if you get hurt.
I used to think it didn't matter what deodorant I chose. Dumb. This test shows that Old Spice is the right choice. Old Spice performs in human situations like basketball, recon, and Frenchie. Try Old Spice, and if you still don't think it's awesome, call 1-800-PROVE-IT, and they'll buy you a stick of something that smells like wildflowers and shame. Take the Old Spice challenge. I did.
Mr. Burgundy, I'm a professional, and I would like to be able to do my job.
Well, big deal. I am very professional.
Mr. Burgundy, you are acting like a baby.
I'm not a baby, I'm a man. I'm an anchor man.
You are not a man. You are a fat joke.
I'm a man who discovered the wheel and built the Eiffel Tower out of metal and bronze. That's what kind of man I am. You're just a woman with a small brain. With a brain a third the size of us. It's science.
Depending on how you drive and your car's condition, you can get incredible mileage from the Goodyear Custom White Tread Polygraph.
Yes, this is the tire commercials of the 60s.
I've got 41,000 miles on my Polyglass. But Polyglass means more than mileage when your wife has to drive alone. When a woman's at the wheel, Polyglass means more than mileage.
I know how we can raise the money. Now, car wash.
Okay, so, yeah, I better stop there. So, state the stereotypes you saw in the video, yeah.
Girl that's supposed to be in the kitchen.
Say again?
Girl that's supposed to be in the kitchen making
Yeah.
food.
Yeah, Kelly Ripa, of all people. That tells you how long she's been around. She doesn't look that old. What else? Yeah.
Girls are bad drivers.
Yeah. Gotta have polyglass. Yep. What else? Mm-hmm.
Kind of just some ideas about like what manliness looks like really tough or but I don't know, the Old Spice commercial was so funny, but
Yeah.
just hearing words like, that are associated with like sweat or
Mhm.
or something.
Yeah, for sure.
I always think it's
And again, the reason I show you all these things is partly because what we see today is a reaction to where we've come from. And those same stereotypes come into play when we're talking about dealing with tough emotional states, if you will. And so the stereotypes come right along with them in terms of how men see themselves, how women see themselves, how they do it. The problem is that the mistake that has been made is that somehow if we diminish the differences between the two genders, somehow that's the same as equality. when in fact what we're doing when we look at the differences between the genders, even in this particular area, is we maximize the options for connection ultimately, not for the only way that things can be equal is if they are perfectly the same, because that really isn't equal at all. Actually, it's uniformity if it's anything. So when we start talking about this subject and look at it, we have to understand the differences between us, and the differences don't have to be demonized. It doesn't make one better than another. We tend to think of it hierarchically. So if one is one way and one is another, then there's one that's better than one that isn't. But if we understand the differences, it actually creates this opportunity for interdependence. And I would say even unity. Because unity has nothing to do with the other two uni words, if you will, uniformity and unanimity. Speaking with one voice, saying the same thing, unanimity, and uniformity is looking the same way. And our tendency is to gravitate toward that which is similar, and we translate similar to familiar, and we translate that into safety. And so when we start to talk about the genders and how they approach dealing with emotional content or whatever that might be, right out of the gate we have to understand that quite honestly, I look at some of that stuff, I remember that stuff, I'm thinking, man, I'm glad we left those decades behind. That was looking back at it, downright archaic. At the same time, we've brought a lot of other things along with us in terms of approaching something as difficult as loss, whatever that looks like. So the thing that we have to look at and talk about at least is this idea of celebrating the differences that creates this space and opportunity for the relationships to deepen and ultimately to reflect God's image. Because remember, the reality that we deal with in terms of how God created us was it took two, not one, to reflect fully his image. And two in a particular way, two that would complement one another, because together they can reflect the whole image of God, not just one of them. And that's a part of, I think, what we even understand when we talk about grief, is that the two genders are socialized very, very differently. I don't think I would have any debate on that point by anyone. But that also translates into when we move into this emotional territory of loss and how we understand who we are within that context and how we actually communicate those. So in light of that, some of you guys have seen this video. I'll show it again just to put some humor in place. And it's men's brains and women's brains. You've seen this video. This is the longer version, so you can actually see the context for it. Some of you guys, I think I showed it in human sexuality. I think that's probably the last time I showed it. I don't remember what. Anyway, Mark Gungor is the speaker. His marriage enrichment is called Laugh Yourself to a Good Marriage. And it's broad brushstrokes. I mean, even this is going to have stereotypes in it. And yet, just because it's a stereotype doesn't mean that there isn't some element of truth to it. And that's particularly true with some of what Mark is talking about here. So here's Mark, and you can hear truth wrapped in humor.
We're going to start discussing men's brains, women's brains, and how they're very different from each other. Now, I want to start with men's brains. All right, now men's brains are very unique. Men's brains are made up of little boxes. And we have a box for everything. We've got a box for the car. We've got a box for the money. We've got a box for the job. We've got a box for you. We've got a box for the kids. We've got a box for your mother somewhere in the basement. We got boxes everywhere. And the rule is, the boxes don't touch. When a man discusses a particular subject, we go to that particular box. We pull that box out. We open the box. We discuss only what is in that box. All right? And then we close the box and put it away, being very, very careful not to touch any other boxes. Sorry, my Catholic upbringing got in there for a minute, but I'm not a Catholic, but I went to Catholic school when I was little. I had a nun who taught on hell like she was born and raised there. I mean, I'll never forget it. It did me good, actually. It was a good thing. Now, women's brains are very, very different from men's brains. Women's brains are made up of a big ball of wire. And everything is connected to everything. Money's connected to the car, the car's connected to your job, and your kids are connected to your mother, and everything's connected to everything. It's like the internet superhighway. And it's all driven by energy that we call emotion. It's one of the reasons why women tend to remember everything. Because if you take an event and you connect it to an emotion, it burns in your memory and you can remember it forever. The same thing happens for men. It just doesn't happen very often because, quite frankly, we don't care. Women tend to care about everything. And she just loves it. Okay? Now, men, we have a box in our brain that most women are not aware of. This particular box has nothing in it. It's true. In fact, we call it the nothing box. And of all the boxes a man has in his brain, the nothing box is our favorite box. If a man has a chance, he'll go to his nothing box every time. That's why a man can do something seemingly completely brain dead for hours on end. You know, like fishing. And we love it. That's why a guy can sit in front of a TV and go. Close. Of course, this drives our wives nuts because they'll come up and say, "Stop! You can't possibly be watching anything!" Go away. Now, they've actually measured this. The University of Pennsylvania a couple of years ago did a study and discovered that men have the ability to think about absolutely nothing and still breathe. You know, they connected all the wires and stuff like that, watch the brain activity, then all of a sudden, I think he's dead! Huh? Women can't do it. They can't do it. Their minds never stop. And they don't understand the nothing box. And it drives them crazy. Because nothing drives a woman more crazy or makes her feel more irritated than to witness a man doing nothing.
Yeah.
Now, one of the biggest revelations I get out of women is this whole nothing box issue. They just, everything's starting to make sense. And I've had women say, oh, it's nothing. Can I go and it's nothing? Now, one of the biggest revelations I get out of women is this whole nothing box issue. They just, everything's starting to make sense. And I've had women say, oh, it's nothing. Can I go and it's nothing box with him? No! Why not? Because then it's something! Besides, you'll walk in there and go, you know, this place can really use some pictures. Nice little table over here, some flowers. No! Nothing! Get out! We don't want nothing! Now, this handles the way men and women handle stress. Okay? When a man is stressed out, all he wants to do is run to his nothing box. This is how we unwind. The last thing we want to do when we're stressed out is talk about it. We don't want to talk about it, we just want to. Of course, this drives her nuts, you know. A woman will see a man in that vegetative state, and she'll come up and go, what you thinking about? Nothing. What are you doing anything about something? Nothing but nothing. Like I was on the road till you showed up. Go away. All right? Because that's how he handles stress. He goes, now, when a woman is stressed out, she has to talk about it. If she doesn't talk about it, her brain will literally explode. So she'll start this. I don't know what that's going to do with this. No, I'm going to have to do that. You know, I never thought about this. I wonder if you and I know men who run from their wives when they do this. Then I say, well, why do you run from her? He says, because I don't know what to tell her. I said, dear God, man, who told you to tell her anything? She wants you to tell her anything. See, a lot of guys, they feel obligated when you start explaining all your stress, they feel obligated to fix you. Right? Because that's what a man does. A man only tells his troubles to another man in hopes that that man will help fix it. Okay? But she's not a man. And you try and fix her, she's gonna kill you. She doesn't want your advice. She doesn't want your help. She wants you to shut up and listen. And come on, They like that. Now, I had one guy tell me, he said, man, she just tell me how she feels. I said, she doesn't know yet. So what it is, that's how she figures out how she feels by connecting this wire to that wire, this wire, so. Now, because they love each other, they offer to each other their answer, their solution. A man senses his wife is stressed out. He loves the girl. He offers to the girl his best and finest solution.
We're just been talking about it. just been thinking about it.
And that's when she starts reaching for the knives and stuff. She's gonna stab you if you keep it up, okay? Now, a woman, she senses her husband's all stressed out. She loves him. Therefore, she offers to him her best and finest solution.
Go away.
He doesn't want to talk to you. Leave him alone. He will not die. He's not a woman. Oh, I know you've got to talk him through or you're going to be twisted inside. He's not like that. Leave the boy alone. He's kind of stressed out. Just let him go to his nothing box. Stay away.
Now, obviously, there are lots and lots of stereotypes in there that Gungor kind of refers to. The one thing I'd have you pay the most attention to is what he said at the very end, is when each person ends up seeing each other in stress, experiencing something, what they offer to the other person is the thing that they deem the best for helping. And that's particularly true in this area that we're talking about with loss. And so the genders oftentimes will miss one another entirely because they keep offering the solution that they deem the best. When it fits them, it may not fit the other person. So when we set some of the stage here in looking at it, there's one kind of table or whatever that might be helpful to put into place. And when we describe he versus she, what you'll see is some different strategies they each use. Gungor refers to some of this as well in the stuff that he was talking about. But a lot of times guys end up running from the emotions by seeing the bigger picture. And the women, on the other hand, and please understand, I'm not insulting the genders. I'm looking at more patterns that oftentimes exist between the differences between the two people. So the details, oftentimes, the interesting thing about it is each gender can run from the emotions in a different way. For men, it's the big picture. What can be, what kind of context can we put this in? What it'll look like down the road, those kinds of things. And women can overwhelm themselves with details. And what that does then is what? It still keeps them away from the emotions that they have. And that's differences between the two. Now, it is not complete. It's brightly delineated between the two. Do each gender do a little bit of both? Yeah, of course they do. And each person tends to head toward one direction or another. The next one is the thinks versus feels idea, and thinking their way through. Now, again, like I said to you guys, when I started all of these stereotypes and other things, that over time I've seen this change even amongst women, where a lot of times there's a value of thinking their way through something, and then the emotions show up a little bit later, or it's at the same time, it's just not identified. I gave you that feeling sheet, and a lot of times people don't identify the emotions for what they are, like what the physical sensation is that goes with frustration, or what the physical sensation goes with when we feel discouraged or something like that. So in a lot of cases, again, we bump into our socialization, whether we like it or not. It still determines how we approach a problem. And in this case, the problem is my emotions. And so guys tell you what they think. Women oftentimes have a richer vocabulary for naming emotions. It may not be comparatively. It really is a huge difference ultimately, because a lot of guys haven't been socialized with what emotions actually are. Another one is more logical and more intuitive. Does it show up in each gender? Of course it does. I mean, there are plenty of people that when you do personality testing or you do other things around that, you'll find that people don't divide up into nice, neat little categories. Women can be every bit as logical as guys can, and again, oftentimes it's a matter of kind of not feeling, and they live within the thoughts that are there. Oftentimes, I've had it happen many times doing groups like you all are sitting through, where I ask somebody what they're feeling and they tell me what they think. And they think that I'm feeling, or I'm feeling that I think, and it ends up being disguised, and it oftentimes just points out what we're avoiding. Coping internally versus coping externally. Again, there's strong socialization, and even in the cultures it's a little bit different. When you go more into Asia and that sort of thing, because it's a face-saving, honor-based culture, you're not going to see this in either one. You'll see all the coping internally in both genders. And then the final thing, again, big stereotypes, cries versus sighs. Expressing and showing emotion. You know, if we did a poll, the number of people that have seen their dad cry or weep in any way, the numbers are going to be pretty small. It doesn't mean there's nothing, but usually it's a remarkable event when a male cries. It is not necessarily a remarkable event when a female cries. And you can call it sexist all you want. The reality is watch our reactions to it. And that tells you pretty much everything you need to know when it comes to that. So when we look at this and talk about another perspective, what I want to kind of introduce you to is something that we talked about in human sexuality that comes out of a research study done by a lady by the name of Carol Gillam. And she wrote a book, In Another Voice. It was not a very popular book. It's gotten even more hated because it's highlighting the differences between the genders. The reason I put this list up is because of how it plays into processing grief and loss between the genders. So if for example, distance equals safety for a lot of men, and closeness equals a threat, what does that look like then in their relationship, their cross-gender relationships? Whereas for women, the closeness equals safety, and distance really equals disconnection and vulnerability. They feel more vulnerable having nothing around them. And that has a direct impact into processing emotions. Because what happens, guys, internalize it. Guess what? That's distance. They create a distance. A lot of times they might be accused of that, is being distant. So there is that. Oftentimes they see the environment, kind of the emotional environment. How do I conquer this? What kind of lists can I derive? What kind of things can I do in order to get this overcome so I don't have it anymore? On the flip side of that, a lot of times for women, it is really based in relationship. So the environment is important, but the relationships they have within that environment are more important. Far and away, and we'll talk about this a little later the farther in we go here, is far and away, women have modeled for them a communal style of grieving. Men do not. They don't. And so the distance equals safety idea, multitasking versus linear processing. You'll hear a lot of people pride themselves in being multitaskers. Usually it's not necessarily simultaneous task doing. Usually it's linear in a quick order that people do. Those are three. There's three more that come along with this. The next one is the idea of listening and attending through questions and versus listening sounds. When Mark said, guys interact with other guys and they do that to fix a problem, then hence the question asking, who, what, where, when, why, how, and then we're done. There's not much else to do. On the other hand, when you listen and watch for women's interaction with each other, in a lot of cases you see a lot more connectedness, whether it's in eye contact or the listening sounds they make or the smaller comments that they make are really part of the landscape of processing the world around them, including their own emotions. So with guys, the feelings versus thoughts, this is an either or a both and. It's either my feelings or my thoughts. It's not both at the same time. And again, is it socialization? Is it genetics? Yes. It's all of those things. They impact us in terms of how we do things. One of the primary questions I ask and a lot of you guys knew I was interviewing a lot of missionary candidates last week. And one of the questions I ask them is, how does your family handle loss? Because I find out everything about how they process hard emotions. And as a general rule, most of the people say, we act like it's not there. We push it under the rug and just walk around it. So we learn a lot of these patterns from what we have modeled for us and what is oftentimes reinforced for us or supported or encouraged. Encouragement doesn't always come in words. I mean, a lot of cases when people start, quote unquote, falling apart, whatever that is, we're watching the other person when that's happening. If we start getting overwhelmed by our emotions, we're watching the other person's face. And if we don't see a significant change in the facial features of the person, or if it actually softens, we will proceed. But if we see this kind of really faint hardening that goes into that person's face, we'll stop. So is that socialization? Yeah, it is. It's either a support or a discouragement from it. Or parents that sigh when their kids cry. Or roll their eyes like, oh, here we go again. Or you know who's so emotional. Heaven forbid people have emotions. So there are subtle messages that are communicated within the family that have a direct impact that when my world turns upside down and I've lost somebody, whether to a lost relationship or a death, or whatever, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm overwhelmed by the emotions. For a lot of people, men and women alike, they just isolate. They just isolate. Because they don't want to put any, they don't want they don't want to be a burden to somebody. They don't want to bring anybody else's world down. Of course, each one of those things is a kind of a robbing of the person's opportunity to actually be compassionate. Is we steal their opportunity to actually do that when we make ourselves a burden and say, I don't want to be that, so therefore then they don't have to do that way. They don't have to respond that way. I don't want to put anybody out. And then rules and structures versus intimacy and relationship. Again, the modeling is there. Carol Gilliam reported watching boys and girls playing games and what happens when one person gets hurt in a game with all guys playing and all girls playing. And you see a very different pattern. And that's what she was pointing out when she was looking at it and trying to understand the patterns that we have. So these may not be as pronounced as they were at the time that she was doing her research, but I think the patterns still exist. And we feel a lot of ambivalence about it because if we feel the pull one direction or another. So that's kind of getting out of the gate, all right? The he and she and some of the ideas of logic versus intuitiveness and so forth. The biggest kind of theorist in this area to talk about the differences between men and women is a person by the name of Havinghurst. And understanding grief in the context, the way that they approach this, and we don't spend a lot of time on this model when we start kind of working our way through the models of grieving and so forth. But this one is in particularly useful because of the differences that it highlights in men and women. The issue isn't to say one way is better than another. It is not anything about that. But it is to identify that there are different phases the two genders go through and in terms of when they go through loss. So this phase one is saying everybody retreats. You know, there's a temporary kind of this management of pain. They isolate, they kind of hunker down, if you will. You can call this denial in terms of the numbness and the disbelief and the disorientation and all the things that go along with this. This is something everybody experiences. And Havinghurst's model really says, all right, there's a goal for each one of these phases. And the first one is grappling with and testing reality as it actually is. Now, when we talked about those mile markers, and I said in genuine grief, there's a less of a struggle with reality. That's a lot of what we see here, is living with the reality of the person being gone, or you know, the dreams being gone, or having the triggers that occur around music or smells or foods or locations or any of those things. And this really is the first phase for the grieving process from Havinghurst's point of view. So the second phase, though, is the one that probably is one of the most important because it includes working through by confronting and enduring, hanging with it, going through the things that the person's experiencing, allowing there to be a range of thinking and feeling and experiencing the person has, whether that's crying or whether that's writing about the disorganization they might feel, whatever that might be. But the goal now has shifted from testing and grappling with reality to detaching from the loved one, but not detaching from the emotions one has. And if you recognize that at all, when we say detaching from emotions, we have another word in psychology. We call it dissociation, right? It's the severing of emotions from the logical kind of factual-based evaluation of the world around us. And so the challenge of this goal, this phase, and why it's so difficult is detaching from the person is hard enough. But how do I manage the emotions that come with that? And generally where people land is they pull away from the emotions as well. And most of their reports about whatever the loss is they've experienced are just that. They're reports. They're factual. They're literally news reports. And generally I can tell by listening to people and watch how they present it. Because I could just as easily put them on the evening news as they're reporting about their emotions. That's not the same. Or as they're reporting about what happened to the person and the loss that they've experienced. It is not the same because it's not integrated. Okay, and so this particular phase, if people actually do go through it, they experience the grief and loss in an integrated fashion. Where we get to next is this phase 3, where there is a resolution beginning, a reorganization around a new life without the person in it, adjusting to the environment. Some of this model may sound vaguely familiar. It's very much like Warden's tier model. So adjusting to the environment, taking on a new identity, new skills, new roles, all of these things are part of phase 3 in having her model. The challenge is these are not set to time. And the way it actually lays out is very similar to that cycle that I showed you between the mile markers that we looked at. Is cycling through the phases. The thing that's key to understand is between men and women will go through all 3 of these, but men oftentimes will not. They will jump past phase 2. And you see it in a variety of ways in terms of how that actually shows up. So the biggest differences between the 2 genders is all around that phase 2. They all retreat. They all kind of hunker down. They all kind of experience the denial and everything else. But in a lot of cases, when men address and deal with grief, they jump past the phase that we just talked about. In terms of the disorientation and processing and all of that, and they go to, how do I reorganize? How do I restructure my life around this person being gone? Is that grief? Yes and no. I mean, I've had a lot of people, but guys in particular, that we have to end up kind of cycle back through and try to reconnect around that phase 2. So with men in grief, they go through 1 and 3. They tend to jump over phase 2. Again, going back to a lot of what we've been taught, even socially, is the idea of showing emotions is bad. It makes one weak. It shows one as being incompetent. So that contributes to not going through phase 2. And what ends up happening a lot of times with people that don't do phase 2, whether it's men or women, is that the grief and all the emotions get suppressed. And remember love's canal. It contaminates the emotional water table. It leaks out into various areas and oftentimes shows up in physical symptoms. GI tract disturbances, headaches, aches and pains, a variety of things. It starts showing up in those particular places. The men who actually express and work through this are really very much the exception than the rule. And so the thing we have to keep in mind is that are we creating a standard of this is how it's supposed to be? Not necessarily. And that's what we have to be careful with, is that when we look at these phases and where somebody goes through it, it's a description, it is not a prescription. And that's some of the finesse that's a part of the conversation in these particular areas that we're talking about. But as a general rule, even this idea of raised not to talk, cry, or reach out is even regionally different from one region of a country to another. And the nature of what's communicated around showing these emotions in the way that they do. So what I want to highlight for you, I'm going to just focus on men for just a minute. And you can flip it pretty reasonably and say that oftentimes you'll not see the opposite, but certainly a different approach to it. I want to look at 4 different areas that shows up with men. The first one, which we already talked about, is to remain silent and keeping the pain to themselves. We are still exposed to images of what manhood looks like in being tough, like you saw in some of the commercials. Those things still hang on. Just because we're not talking about them doesn't mean that they don't influence men's behavior. But what comes up here is it looks like they don't need to communicate about their grief. Ultimately, the non-communication, at least in their way of thinking, protects them against being vulnerable, which to them expressing it is not inconveniencing other people, and expressing it usually is catastrophized. In other words, just like it is for many of us, is I don't want to start crying because if I do, it'll never stop. Or I'll be falling apart. Or I'm having a breakdown. Or a meltdown. We have all sorts of shame-laden terms that we attach to some of these things. So this idea of remaining silent, while probably more profoundly displayed in men, obviously it is displayed in women as well. How do we get there, in terms of helping people recover and resolve some of the grief that they experience? Usually, unfortunately, it violates this particular tendency. And trying to provide an outlet for that is really tough to do. Because men will not go. Now, a lot of guys who do end up in a grief recovery group go because their wives are taking them. It's usually not because they have chosen to go there. The second one is they engage in secret grief. They have private ceremonies of their own or rituals of their own that they engage in. They do this solitary mourning to spare people of what they're experiencing and the nature of what goes on there. So for most men, to do otherwise would feel like they're violating cultural expectations. And this is the socialization. And I'll show you one good example. One story, and I know you guys won't recognize this name, but a comedian pair, a comedic pair of people that were really popular in the late 40s or 50s and 60s was a guy by the name of George Burns. And George Burns was funny, had this dry sense of humor, and for the longest time his sidekick was his wife, Gracie. And in most, comedic teams that we see, usually one's the straight man and the other is the one that's always busting on them. So Rowan and Martin during the 60s was a good example of that. Dean Martin and Bing Crosby, you see them interacting that way as well. But Gracie and George were very much a pair, and they were very popular. They got their start in radio like so many of them did. And George Burns, and she died. And the story goes that George Burns was very much affected by Gracie. It basically broke their pair apart. And for what they were known. It wasn't until much later that George Burns started showing up in other movies and so forth that was really his first appearances. And the thing that is told about George Burns was he would have his chauffeur driver drive him to her graveside at least once a week, sometimes more. And he would take a chair with him, and he would sit by the graveside, and this was his kind of private ritual of mourning for Gracie. And we see that a lot in a lot of times the older men that end up kind of conveying or communicating, don't show anybody, don't put anybody out with what you may be experiencing. This is also the time when they oftentimes will launch into action. Physical or legal action. There's a lot of energy that gets generated around grief that is really pushed by anger. In a lot of cases, men will immediately attempt to right the record, if you will, if they feel like somebody has conducted malpractice or there's been a wrong done of whatever sort. There are lots of people actually today that are voices for whether it's gun control or child abduction or something like that. They're all men, and their pursuit of justice, if you will, was very much driven along by the loss that they had experienced. So in a lot of cases, the people around them support them and encourage them to go this direction because it is them being assertive about what they're feeling, and that's oftentimes seen as a positive sign. Now it is and it isn't, because in a lot of cases we get so distracted in our causes that we never really address the pain that we're experiencing, and that's true for a lot of men. The last one, they become immersed in activity. They get obsessive about a lot of the activities that they can do that will distract them from the things that they're experiencing. Hello, where'd you go? There it is. And they will find things to occupy their time. They'll start up a new hobby. They will do a variety of things, and it seems like that they find every way to fill every waking minute so that they just don't feel anything. It's not uncommon that during this phase, you see them developing addictions during this phase, because it is a ready-made way to medicate the pain that they're in. So you don't see this as much for women, because like I said, the standard of communal grieving is a little bit more established in the socialization for women, so they reach out to one another quite naturally, and that leaves an outlet. So let me show you an example, okay, of this private grief. A lot of you guys may have watched or may cringe when I say this, but the Rocky movies. Sylvester Stallone in the movie, eventually the love of his life, Adrian, dies, and you wonder how many more Rocky movies we're going to see. Of course, probably until he dies. But this particular one actually captures this private ritual thing. And what I want to show you is just how he does it and what goes on in his head. He's got another voice in his life that says a lot like, just get over it, rock and move on. And yet, this is very much a very valid part of his grief process. Let me turn the lights off here.
Time goes by too fast.
Yeah, not fast enough. Your kid should have been there.
That's all right, boy.
No, it ain't all right.
The kid gets a little busy sometimes.
We don't get that busy.
Well, let's not talk about it here, okay? You're coming tonight, right?
I'm working. I took the tour the last 3 years.
I know, but it's the anniversary.
Fine, you got my word.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I owe you, Paul.
this little smile. And all I wanted her to do was trust me. She did. She did. We done?
Come on, Rob, let's go.
Is it angry?
Angry?
Are you mad because Adrian left you?
She didn't leave, Paul. She died.
Okay. Okay.
You know, sometimes it's hard to breathe. You know, I felt this beast inside me.
It's okay, Rocco. Please, it's okay.
Is it? Okay. I just never knew it was supposed to be this hard. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Paul, you know it. You know, I could have done nothing without you. You know, Adrian, we did it. We did it.
It's an interesting journey that actually happens in that entire film. As you see at the very beginning, I've kind of pulled clips out of it, of where it started, where he started with these private kind of rituals that he went through, and how it ends then, and saying goodbye and walking away, and no chair. He wasn't planning on coming back. It was the time to move on, and that's that kind of phase 3 part and the way that a lot of times men will show up with this secret grief kind of thing that they experience and go through. So there's a couple other things I want to point out to you, and then we'll get into what this actually looks like in relationship. But I'm going to stop here. Any questions? You guys have any questions on any of this? Okay, well, we will pick up next week, and you can enjoy your groups for the rest of the week.